Is it the case that the laws of supply and demand no longer apply? It certainly feels that way, but let's look at it in a little bit more detail, because the reality is we're seeing price spikes all over the place, particularly in the well-publicized areas of energy and so forth. But there's a certain amount of artificial massaging going on, which is understandable, where obviously in terms of energy there are price caps in place which force a situation where suppliers are absorbing virtually all of the price increase, but also retailers are, to the best of their ability, absorbing a lot of price increases simply because consumers generally won't accept the sort of price increases that a natural supply and demand scenario would suggest at this moment. That doesn't mean that the normal economic rules don't apply, it just means they're being artificially massaged at the moment, and it is inevitable, in my opinion, that this is a short-term situation and normal market movements will return. This is an issue in large part to do with complexity of supply chains. Supply chains nowadays are unbelievably complex, and components are sourced from quite literally across the globe. Now, clearly that works in normal times, but there is an immutable law of supply chains, which is that it's only as good as its weakest link. And what this latest series of circumstances have exposed is that there are some pretty weak links in some of the supply chains that are out there, and that's having a direct consequence to availability. Where are the obvious, publicly visible issues around supply chain weakness? Well, clearly the new car market has to be the standout example, because there is such a shortage of chips, microchips that make virtually all cars work nowadays, that waiting times on new cars are significantly extended, which of course has a consequential effect on its own marketplace, not only prices going up, but of course the used car market particularly has been an unintended beneficiary of that set of circumstances, because the cost of used cars has increased substantially as a result of the shortage of new cars. So how is the overall marketplace functioning if we're going to go back to laws of supply and demand and a demand economy, the free market, all of that, of which obviously supply chains are a part? We have to ask ourselves, how has it performed recently in the face of all these issues? And I think first of all we have to look at what stresses it's been under, and you have a combination which is pretty much the perfect storm of Brexit, clearly the pandemic, China shutting down big part of the world's supply of almost everything, Vietnam shutting down with the COVID Delta variant. I mean, just even Suez being blocked, you know, these are huge issues. And yet, let's be honest about this, I shop in a supermarket most days, and I seldom see empty shelves, one or two maybe here and there, but the reality is most products are getting through most of the time. That tells me that, broadly speaking, and there are clearly some issues around some products, but broadly speaking, this system, this just-in-time system that can be quite maligned at times, has actually proved to be surprisingly robust in what can only be described as completely unprecedented time of stress. So actually, well done. What is the problem if there is a problem? Well, we've just discussed what the root causes of any problems might have been. That is to say, global economy shut down for a period of time and various other awful things happened at the same time. Clearly there is some politics behind this, particularly from a UK point of view as well, and the government had set out its response to particularly labour shortages as a what you would describe as a cold turkey situation, where their determination has been to improve productivity, because the UK has lagged badly in terms of productivity historically over the last 25 or 30 years. The government's argument is that is largely due to an addiction to cheap foreign labour, and therefore they have created a set of circumstances where industry has to wean itself off the huge availability of vast pools of cheap foreign labour, and thus the only way to maintain profitability is to improve productivity. That's quite a chunk of social engineering to go cliff edge on, and what's actually been happening is the government, bless them, go, that's the line in the sand, we're not going to allow this to happen, and then shortages start and there are no truck drivers and so forth, and they go, well, we'll allow a bit of it to happen and then a bit more. And so we're kind of yo-yoing between doctrine and commercial reality. Where all that falls, I can't predict, but there's a very interesting historical precedent, goes back to just after the First World War in the United States, where they had been used to mass immigration up to the First World War, where you had millions of people arriving every year, forming this vast low-cost labour pool, which was fine and was useful for the industrial barons to make an absolute fortune without having to invest huge amounts of money. But they changed their immigration laws after the First World War, and as a result, the flow of immigrants really narrowed to a trickle. The consequence of that was actually, over the 20s and 30s, the biggest improvement in unit labour productivity in United States history. They realised they had to invest in production lines and mechanisation and all that type of stuff, and they became very, very productive indeed. So that is one possible outcome of all of this, but I would stress possible outcome. There are many potential other outcomes. This phrase, just in time, has, to a large extent, become, if not a discredited practice, it certainly is, it's taken some reputational battering. And yet, actually, just in time was a economic approach, or a commercial approach to supply that was developed during the 50s to actually ensure, developed by Honda, I believe, and was developed to ensure that there were no shortages and the right product was at the right place at the time that it was needed. And it served us pretty well ever since. And we have to look at what the alternative is, because the opposite to just in time is just in case. And just in case is a nice way of saying stockpiling. And the consequence of stockpiling is to actually exacerbate shortages rather than to, in the short term, it might ameliorate a bit, but the reality is supply is supply is supply. You know, there's a finite amount of it, and if everybody, let's take loo rolls as a really well documented example. If consumers go over to a just-in-case approach, they buy 6 months of loo rolls instead of next week's worth. Well, we know what happens then. So we have to be careful about being rude about just-in-time, because it is actually the better model. Particularly with respect to UK small business, are there any actions that they could or should be taking to manage this period of uncertainty? And I think we have to, this is going to be frightfully generalized, but I think we have to look at some realities, and that is that small business, particularly those that carry stock, will be almost always operating on a just-in-time basis. Stocking costs for a small company are a significant part of their overhead, and they're not going to want to tie up tons of cash in stock that isn't actually leaving the warehouse tomorrow. The reality is that most will probably have supply chains that are heavily relationship-based. A small business is a relationship-driven thing, and the chances are that most will not have had the either opportunity or motivation to significantly research alternative supply providers. Now might be a good time to do that. There is always more than one way of sourcing goods, and I would recommend that small business owners take the time out to source, again, on a just-in-case basis, but not a stocking approach, but on the basis that their existing supply chains may not be as robust as they think they are. Now would be a good time to look at what the alternatives are. Equally, I would also suggest they have a frank conversation with all the suppliers they currently use and test their ability to continue to provide these goods in circumstances which may be more difficult. A root and branch investigation of their own, the robustness of their own operation in terms of supply would be a very, very good place to start. I would also suggest a bit of a war chest, if I'm going to be honest. I think that raising some funds to see a business through a period of constrained supply would be a very, very sensible approach to take as well. So where does all that leave us? From a personal point of view, I would say that I remain cautiously optimistic. These have been extraordinary times, absolutely unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime. Most businesses, for the most part, are actually doing all right, which tells me that reasonably optimistically, the system is working probably a lot better than we had a right to expect. Yeah, well done us.